They laughed as the metal bit shut around his wrist. The sound was small against the morning, a harsh click that might have been swallowed by traffic in the low thrum of the city, yet it landed like a bell. Laughter rose, thin and ugly, a pair of officers trading jokes as if the man they had just cuffed were a punchline. "You don't belong here, boy," one of them said, and the words found the pavement, the courthouse steps, the line of people waiting to enter. He did not shout. He did not lunge. He held himself the way he had been trained to hold himself all these years, still, deliberate, as if time were a thing you can shepherd around you. The handcuffs bit into his skin. The leather of his shoes scraped stone when they pushed him down. A smear of blood gathered on one knee where a heel had pressed too hard. Someone from the crowd, an early morning attorney, a woman from the clerk's office, started recording. Phones rose like a flock of small, bright witnesses. A security guard named Kenny, broad-shouldered and fastidious about the courthouse's rules, bristled at once and moved in. "He's the judge," he said beneath his breath, the words not for the officers, but for the woman on the phone. Martha, who had been in the clerk's office since before daylight and who knew every robe, every docket, every whisper of the building, ran toward them, her cardigan slipping from under an arm like a flag. "You don't know who this is," she called, breathless. "He's—" "Sir, step back," another officer barked. The laughter rose again, this time with a harsher edge, as if the presence of a woman demanding answers were merely seasoning for the joke. "You got ID? You got anything that says you belong here?" The man on the ground looked up, and for a moment 1,000 small things lined up. The courthouse's stone facade behind him, the engraved phrase above the door, "Equal justice under law," worn into the city sky, the morning sun catching the gold edge of a little pin on his lapel. He did not reach for it. He had been taught that authority dressed itself not in motion, but in stillness. So he waited, eyes steady, and watched the phones tilt toward him. If this angers you, share this, not for clout, but so someone else becomes a witness. Minutes earlier, the morning had been ordinary in the way only a courthouse morning can be ordinary. A stream of people moving through metal detectors, the click of heels, the rustle of papers, a scent somewhere between old coffee and lemon disinfectant. Marcus Thompson, chief judge of the county for 15 years, walked the same route he had walked for longer than many of the assistants around him had been alive. He knew the cracked tile by the east entrance. He knew the portrait of the founder that hung crooked in the hallway. He had presided over misdemeanors and felonies, over divorces and guardianships, over the ceremonial things that steadied a city and the small tragedies that eroded it.
He was not a man who sought spectacle. His robes were clean but not ostentatious. His suit beneath them bore the soft familiarity of clothes that had been worn into correctness rather than display. He greeted Martha with a nod, exchanged a brief joke with the senior clerk, small courtesies that only the steady make room for, and signed in the way judges sign in, not to show off, but to account. There had been a moment earlier that seemed like nothing at all. Kenny had paused him at the metal detector. Protocol, he said, quickly, procedural, and asked for ID. Marcus produced his judicial ID without fuss. The detector had beeped once. The machine had accepted him. The conveyor belt had pushed a purse forward. The morning resumed. He took a call about a delayed hearing and smiled politely into the receiver. He slid his robe over his arm and began up the marble stair. Somewhere in the back of his mind there was always the knowledge that being a man who looked like him in this building carried an extra weight. He had learned long ago that respect wore thin at the edges of habit, that people could be polite one moment and careless the next. But the courthouse had been his home and his instrument. He believed, as he had fought for years to prove, that law could be a shield against the small cruelties of life. On the day the laughter cut like a bell, shelter ceded ground to the ordinary cruelty of assumption. Officer Derek Miller and Officer Wilson arrived by way of swagger and preconception. There are uniforms that carry themselves with the confidence of a second skin, and theirs fit like that. Sharp badges glittering, radios chattering, a readiness to translate every unremarkable movement into suspicion. They had been called about a disturbance in the parking lot, a man refusing to move, a complaint about someone who didn't look like he belonged. Whether the call was a product of impatience or malice would be a question for later. At the lot, where the asphalt still held the cold of dawn, Marcus had been in no hurry. He had spent a moment adjusting his cuffs, took in the way pigeons traced the fountain's edge, and walked toward his car. Kenny was at the entrance, doing the job of being watchful. Martha had not yet reached the lot when Miller stepped in front of Marcus, blocking his path with the kind of move that was practice and posture. "Sir," Miller said, "not polite, not rude, precise. We need to see your ID. Move over here, please." Marcus reached for his wallet. He produced his identification, which the officer held like an unfamiliar relic. Miller squinted and frowned and passed the piece of paper to Wilson as if it weren't enough, as if their own instincts could do more than a simple card. "You're going to have to come with us," Miller said suddenly, the edge in his voice like a decision made to fill the silence. "We can't have people roaming the lot who don't belong." Marcus stood still. He asked nothing. He offered no protest. The first cuff slid around his wrist in the way an idea becomes a plan, swift and premeditated. The second cuff clicked, and the force that bent his elbow did not need to be loud to be sharp. He was pushed to his knees on the cold asphalt. The posture was intended to humiliate. The officers moved like it was routine. He glanced up at the courthouse facade, where the words, carved long ago and given a soft patina by rain and pigeons, said one thing, and the scene below them performed another. The cameras of several phones focused in. Martha ran to the edge of the lot and saw the judge on his knees. Her mouth opened, a sound caught between a gasp and the beginning of outrage. "This is wrong," she said, the words small and precise. "He's a judge. Take your hands off him." The laughter did not stop. It thickened, bending toward a cruelty that felt rehearsed. "Look at him," one officer said. "Thinks he's better than us." They traded barbs. The crowd shifted. Someone cursed. There was an old lawman's instinct that lived quietly in Marcus. He knew the scene must have witnesses, must have trace evidence, must have record. He felt the metal against his skin and thought of how heavy and how light the badge was, the badge that didn't change human habit but could sometimes force an institution to answer for it. He thought of the cameras, which now hummed with the quiet electricity of phones, and a courthouse security camera that had been trained on the lot for months. He knew the power of seeing, how the photon of an image could change a story into evidence. He kept his breathing slow. He held his face steady in the way he had learned to hold a gavel, to let weight fall where it needed to, and to show nothing it couldn't bear. Martha shoved through the ring of onlookers and demanded to see the officer's identification. Kenny, taut with a mixture of fear and anger, pulled his radio and tried to call for higher authority. People in suits stopped their walk and watched. Lawyers with coffee cups hesitated over the absurdity of the scene, and the courthouse doors seemed to press themselves closed in the background, as if saving themselves for a later chapter. Among the small witnesses was a young security officer who had only just finished training, Officer Patterson. He had been assigned to the morning's perimeter. He watched the way the cuffs bit, the way the officers traded jokes, the way the handcuffs made a sound like a small closing of a world. He looked away once, and then he looked back, and something in his chest tightened the way a string tightens before a bow is pulled. He did not yet know his own future, but he knew the shape of a wrong thing. When someone in the crowd finally said out loud, "That's Judge Marcus Thompson," it did not land as a revelation so much as a shockwave. The name had weight. The laughter faltered, then stuck like gravel, but phones that had been capturing everything now tilted toward the officers' faces.
A video feed from a nearby patrol car's dash cam, which had been rolling quietly as part of routine, caught the tail end of the arrest. A security camera above the lot, whose monotone gaze had recorded the morning's comings and goings and the steady movements of a building that had seen more than its share of human error, hummed and relayed the image. Recognition performed in alchemy. The sequence flipped. The man who had been the object of mockery became a person who carried a public name. The officer's tone shifted, microseconds in which denial and recalibration tried to find their footing. "He's gotta be someone," Miller began, but his sentence slowed under the weight of the data now surfacing. A judicial ID retrieved by Martha from a sleeve, the courthouse security feed spooling up on a portable tablet, the dash cam capturing Miller's own approach. When the feeds played back, the beat by beat of the interaction sat naked in the light. Marcus did something in those moments that forced the scene to move from ridicule to accountability without a sound. He closed his mouth. He did not raise his voice. He looked toward the courthouse as if considering his options, and then toward the crowd, letting them see his composure. He knew there were steps he could take that would end this morning quietly, private phone calls, internal memos, a lawyer's note filed out of sight, but he also knew the perverse logic of power, that private remedies often feed impunity. He had spent a career arguing that law's shield did little good if only brandished behind closed doors. If you wanted system change, you had to make the system stare at itself. "You're under arrest for resisting," Miller said, less certain now. "I am not resisting," Marcus answered, voice low, precise. "I am being detained without cause." Those words were not dramatic. There was no rising crescendo, no theatrical flourish. But the cadence of his voice carried the kind of authority cultivated at the bench,
the authority that knows the ordinary weight of words and how to put them where they might be useful. Someone in the crowd started chanting his name before it became organized. A murmur of phones rose to a chorus. Within minutes, the courthouse's internal phone lines began to light up. Judge Reynolds in chambers, the mayor's office, the county administrator. People who had a stake in the building's reputation came quick and tense. Mayor Patricia Williams arrived with the briskness of someone who understood optics and consequences. The commissioner, Hayes, phoned and then arrived, posture taut with the need to contain the embarrassment before it metastasized into crisis. Their steps through the foyer were fast, their faces guarded. Miller's posture recalibrated in the face of authority. Wilson Fidget, checking his radio, scanning for a script to fall back on. The rookie, Patterson, watched as the adults in the room found their roles like actors finding marks on a stage.
He had seen a kindness in Martha's face, an indignation tempered by the long memory of working in a building that knew its share of indignities. For a moment, the scene resembled a test, whether the city's formal authorities would respond to the rawness that had unfolded in front of the courthouse's carved creed. Marcus could have stepped aside then. He could have taken the path of private redress. Instead, he breathed, focused, and let the evidence do the work he could not do with a raised voice. Kenny produced a small worn leather case from his belt, where he kept a dozen mundane things: a tape measure, a flashlight, a spare pen. And inside, beneath the worn elastic, lay Marcus's judicial badge. It was tiny, ordinary, a little disc of metal his clerks joked about for being too discreet. When Kenny slid it across and the badge caught the morning light, there was a hush that felt like a held breath. "That is Judge Marcus Thompson," Martha said again, and this time the words had the authority of documentation. A phone camera zoomed close enough to read the engraving on the badge. The dashcam footage that had recorded the approach was queued up, and a young prosecutor, Sarah Chen, who ran a unit charged with ensuring that prosecution itself did not slip into indifference, watched with the quiet attention of someone already thinking about proof. Marcus was freed from the cuffs in a motion that felt abrupt because everything about it was abrupt. Hands that minutes earlier had been snug and unyielding now opened mid-air like an apology. Miller's expression folded into a set of defensive lines. The mood in his voice had shifted from easy mockery to the practiced unreadability of someone who understands consequences. "You're free to go," Commissioner Hayes said, his words clipped and a little brittle. He did not speak to Marcus so much as to everyone assembled, to the officers, to the crowd, to the cameras. "This will be investigated." Marcus stood, testing his knee briefly. There was blood on the fabric of his trousers, a small and unquestionable mark of what had happened. He did not wipe it away. He straightened his suit and took his robe from where it had been folded against his arm. There was a certain theatricality in the movement, a man reclaiming an outer sign of the authority that had been mocked. But Marcus wore no triumph. He wore instead a measured resolve. He walked up the marble steps, and as he climbed, the crowd parted not from a posse's force, but from the recognition of a man returning to his place. Some people cheered, others whispered, a few held their phones high. Cameras, public and private, followed him. The motif of recording had carried the morning. Phones were no longer mere witnesses, but weapons and torches. The dashcam footage would ensure there was an indelible record. The security logs would show the timestamps. The clerk's ledger that Martha kept by rote would supply a human timeline.
Inside the courthouse, the main courtroom was still being prepared for that day's hearings. A large oak bench awaited, the gavel in its resting place like a tool on a machinist's bench, neat, functional, ready. Marcus paused only long enough to fold his robe around his shoulders and let the fabric settle. The little pin on his lapel caught light again, the same as outside. He stepped up to the bench as if he had never left it at all. "Order," someone called from the gallery, not because decorum demanded it. The room that morning did not yet hold a docket, but as a quiet recognition that something had been restored to its place. A murmur went through the gallery. Phones buzzed. The footage that had been playing on handheld devices outside was now being shared and spread along the courthouse's internal lines. Martha, breath still shallow, sat near the front and watched Marcus settle into the rhythm of the bench. Her eyes glistened, not with unthinking approval, but with the fatigue of someone who had worked long enough to know that symbolic acts could be both small and consequential. Marcus did not use his robe to claim a moral victory. He let the robe be what it was,
a uniform for the job he had been given. He did not denounce the officers from the bench. He instead issued a calm directive to the courtroom staff to preserve all recordings and to ensure that every piece of evidence was logged. His voice was the same one he used in closing arguments, clear, measured, with the kind of authority that makes people notice the difference between speaking and ordering. There were faces in the room Marcus had not expected to see. Mayor Patricia Williams, who had hovered near the doorway as if weighing the political cost of visibility. Commissioner Hayes, whose jaw had coaxed itself into an expression that might later be called contrition, or might later be explained away as concern. Sarah Chen, the prosecutor, who scanned the courtroom like a person cataloging possible approaches. Frank Morrison, the police union president, loomed at the back, stern, impassive, clearly attuned to the narrative as a thing that could be guided if only one had the will. The air inside the courtroom felt different from the air outside, thicker, as if the building itself inhaled. People turned their faces to Marcus not because they had to, but because for a moment their attention needed a focus. Marcus did not take the opportunity to grandstand. He asked that the clerk preserve all footage recorded that morning, that the security tapes be sealed, that an independent chain of custody be established. He asked calmly and precisely for witness statements from those present. He asked that those who had recorded on phones come forward and upload their files to the court's secure channel. "Record what you have," he said quietly to the room, and his words sounded like instruction and like plea at once. "Preserve it. We must have an unbroken trail."
Miller and Wilson sat in the front row, not cuffed now, but looking smaller than their uniforms made them. Miller's mouth worked with an attempt at a defense. His posture was the posture of someone who understands that the narrative has turned against him. Patterson stood just outside the doorway, his hands clasped as if to steady something inside him. He looked like a man caught between the way he had been taught to act and the simple moral clarity that sometimes arrives when a wrong is plain. The first movement of official accountability was not a headline or a declaration. It was paperwork, a directive from the mayor to place the officers on administrative duty pending an independent review, a terse memo that Commissioner Hayes signed with a hand that did not tremble but that carried the scent of caution. It was the sheriff's office agreeing, reluctantly, to hand over dashcam footage to a civilian review. It was Sarah Chen asking for a special prosecutor to be kept available should criminal charges be warranted. Marcus listened to these arrangements like someone mapping a path through a dense wood. They were steps, they were not guarantees. He knew how institutions can muffle outrage into meetings and turn momentum into memos. He had lobbied for reform in chambers and found the dead weight of habit to be a stubborn adversary. Yet in this moment, with cameras as corroboration and witness statements stacking like cards, he allowed himself to believe the machinery could, perhaps, be set to work. Outside, the crowd swelled. Jerome, a boy of 12 who lived around the block and had watched court proceedings with the hunger of a child making room for himself in a future he barely imagined, stood with his mother at the foot of the steps. He had seen the scene in the lot and had watched Marcus step back into the building with the robe around his shoulders like a promise. Jerome's breath came out in small puffs. He had a notebook and he scribbled, not the way a lawyer writes, but the way a child prays on paper, messy and intent. This was, in the small way of neighborhoods and afternoons and calendars, the seed of the story that would later be told to others, how one morning laughter had become a mirror, and how a man had chosen to stand where he was and make the record. But inside the room, the practical began to crowd in. Marcus did not pretend that his robe had erased the wrong. He did not pretend that a few memos would dismantle the patterns that made the wrong possible. He was not naive about the union's influence, Frank Morrison's instinct to protect members at almost any cost, or the tendency of some in the force to circle the wagons when any one of them was exposed. He also knew the power of an institution to correct itself when the public's eye was fixed, and when evidence, clear, preserved, recorded, was placed where it could no longer be ignored.
He called for the court clerk's log, requested the security footage, and asked Martha to begin compiling a witness list. The motion itself was ordinary, but the intent behind it was not. It was to build a narrative of proof from the pieces. Dashcam, security tapes, handheld videos, witnesses, his own injured knee. He wanted the morning to exist not as rumor, but as recorded fact. There was a terrible, intimate clarity in stepping from mockery into the bench. The robe did not restore dignity like a talisman. It allowed a man to speak from a platform he had been given by the community.
It made possible the simple act of naming what had happened and asking for the institution to answer. Marcus used that platform not to punish with rhetoric, but to insist on a process that could lead to accountability. "Today," he said, looking out over the people assembled, "we begin by being clear about what happened. We will preserve evidence. We will ensure witnesses are heard. We will not let this moment dissolve into private explanations." No one cheered at the end of the sentence. There was only the scratch of a pen, the whisper of feet, the quiet warmth of 100 phones mapping the court's interior into an archive. Marcus sat back in the judge's chair, the robe pooling modestly around him like the cloak of a profession more than the cloak of a man. Outside the courthouse, the political and the procedural began to orbit. Mayor Williams, whose attention to the event was both ethical and strategic, requested a closed-door briefing with the commissioner. Frank Morrison made a terse public statement defending his membership's right to due process, and the union's lawyers began to circle. Sarah Chen, the prosecutor, made no public remarks apart from confirming that the appropriate files would be reviewed, and that if criminal charges were supported by evidence, she would not shy from pursuit. Patterson, the rookie who had been present at the arrest, lingered. He watched Marcus with the intense focus that comes when a person confronts the gap between a learned behavior and an emergent conscience. Marcus caught the young officer's gaze for a moment. No condemnation, no indulgence, only the look of someone who recognized a choice in front of another person. "Stay," Marcus said quietly when their eyes met. "Tell the truth." It was not a command for retribution, and it was not a plea that sought to punish him for his presence. It was a moment of moral clarity offered to someone at the doorway of their future. As the morning edged toward noon, the courthouse became a node of attention. Phones hummed. Clips were uploaded to a dozen platforms. Local reporters staked a perimeter. The security footage found its way into private hands, and then into public conversation.
The rawness of the arrest, the small crudeness of cuffs, the bad humor of mockery, the smear of blood, had been transformed into a set of items that could be assembled into a case. Timestamps, witness lists, dashcam footage, a record of prior complaints that Martha quietly produced from a filing cabinet where she kept notes on recurring disputes. The pattern that those who study systemic behavior call a trend began, quietly, to make itself visible. Marcus's choice had been simple in action and complex in consequence. He had declined the private remedy and chosen to place what had happened in the public record. The public record would not make everything right, but it would make the truth harder to deny. As people filed out of the courtroom, some to make statements, some to grumble, some to avoid being seen, the sound of the city returned. Yet something had shifted in the courthouse's rhythm. The cameras had performed their civic function. The people had been witnesses in more than presence. The badge that had been mocked had been recognized, and the robe that had been used to assert authority had been reclaimed. Marcus stepped down from the bench for a moment, not presiding over a docket, but presiding over the simple business of ordering the next steps. He asked the clerk to seal the recordings and provide copies to an independent counsel. He ordered that any officer who had used force that morning be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. He asked that community liaisons be informed so that the people who live around the courthouse would know the steps being taken. None of these actions resolved the deeper problems. They were first steps, small and bureaucratic and essential. They were the opening moves in what could become a long fight against a culture that had allowed a man to be treated as less than while standing in front of words etched into stone. There was, in the moments before Marcus returned to his chambers, a kind of quiet victory in his simple movement back into his robe. Cameras had captured him entering with dignity restored not by force but by procedure. The symbolic arc, mocked on the pavement, returned to the bench in robes within minutes, was complete in its immediate terms. People would talk about the image, the cuffs in the robe, the smear of blood on a sleeve, and the gavel waiting at the bench. Images would splice together into narratives that could be used for cautionary tales or rallying cries. For Marcus, the object was not image, but accountability. Yet even as he took his seat, the longer work waited, assembling evidence into a coherent record, arguing for an independent inquiry rather than a closed in-house review, demanding reforms that would change practices, not just punish the moment.
He was aware, with the hard clarity of one who had spent years in public life, that the city's machinery could either be a vehicle for redress or a machine for smoothing sharp edges until they were no longer visible. He thought of Jerome, the boy on the steps who had watched it all and scribbled in a notebook, and he thought of the small ways dignity is taught, by example, by record, by the courage of witnesses. He thought of the rookie standing at the doorway,
and the possibility that one person's conscience could tilt the arc of a life. The building's clock ticked, indifferent and steady. Outside, a woman called out Marcus's name, and someone else began to record a statement. The dashcam footage continued to upload into the evidence folder that the clerk's office had prepared. The morning had yielded both shame and a new kind of vigilance. But the story did not end at the bench. It threaded forward into halls where union power and municipal politics would push back, into rooms where legal arguments about custody chains and administrative procedures would be made, into a future where the community would demand more than apologies. Marcus, who had been mocked on the pavement minutes earlier, had re-entered the building in robes and had used the authority of his office to set in motion the mechanisms that might, if enough people persisted, begin to alter habit. He rose from the bench then, briefly, and stepped toward the doorway. Cameras tracked him. The phones were like hands held out in witness. The morning's laughter had been transmuted into something else, a public insistence that wrong not be smothered. Marcus felt the weight of the robe and the lighter weight of the public eye. He felt also, quietly and with a certain sober hope, the beginning of an alignment between law and the people it serves. When he crossed the threshold back into the hall, Jerome's small voice rose above the rest. "Judge Thompson," and the boy waved a notebook clumsily, as if it were a banner. Marcus paused, offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, and walked on. The cameras recorded the smile, the phones recorded the walk, the security tapes locked the image into an archive. It was not a resolution. It was a pivot. The bruised knee and the evidence folders were waiting. The union's resistance and the commissioner's calculations would follow. Papers would be filed. Names would be called. The city would be watching and would have to decide whether watching would be enough. For now, the robe had returned dignity where laughter had tried to take it away. A man had been mocked in the lot. Minutes later, he had entered court in robes. But the path from that moment to lasting accountability would be a long one, a sequence of small acts, procedural rigor, public insistence, and the persistence of witnesses who refused to let a recorded image be swallowed by indifference.
In the hallway, a young officer who had stood by earlier, Patterson, finally folded his hands and approached quietly. His voice was low and a little rough. "Sir," he said, I was there. I saw it differently at first. I want to tell what I saw." Marcus looked at him, not with triumph, but with a steady sorrow that held a kind of mercy for the man standing before him. "Start by telling the truth," he said, "and when you can, help make sure it's preserved." Patterson nodded. Behind them, Martha gathered the witness list. Kenny walked back out to the lot to stand where the handcuffs had clicked. Jerome's mother recorded a short clip on her phone and sent it to a neighbor, and the clip was shared again and again, traveling in waves that felt like pressure and like promise all at once. The morning had one more small, significant motion before it bent into the work that would follow. Marcus placed a call to Sarah Chen and asked her to consider a special counsel if the evidence supported criminal charges. She agreed to take a look. There was a quiet exchange between the judiciary and the prosecutorial arm of the state that felt like the turning of a page. Outside, the marble steps shone in the sun. The phrase above the entrance, "Equal justice under law," had never seemed more brittle nor more necessary. People left the courthouse with different impressions. Some satisfied that the system had, at least initially, responded. Others skeptical that the initial motion of accountability would hold under pressure. Marcus himself knew the rhythm of such moments. He had seen gestures of contrition, followed by slow absorption into the ways things had always been done. He had also seen a rare coalition form when evidence and witness and moral will lined up. He had, in the space of a morning, moved from being an object of mockery to the place where he could insist evidence be conserved and steps be taken. He had entered the court in his robe. He had used that position to ask for what would make that transition more than a single day's narrative: chain of custody protocols, independent review, and public oversight. The hallways began to empty into the deeper work of investigation. Phones stopped buzzing for a breath. People filed into hearing rooms where the small motions of bureaucracy would test the capacity of the city to act. Marcus sat for a long moment in his chambers and let the robe lie across the back of a chair, the fabric settling like a quiet witness. Beyond the windows, the city carried on. A child on a stoop pointed to the courthouse and told a friend that he had seen something important. Jerome sent a text,
Short, eager, and building-laden. See you in court someday. The message vibrated with a promise that made Marcus both proud and wistful. He did not yet know how the union would react. He did not yet know whether the retained footage would be contested on procedural grounds.
He did not yet know whether the arrival of political calculation would dilute the momentum. He did know the value of witnesses and of records. He did know that the image of him in cuffs and then in robes would not, by itself, fix the larger architecture of practices that allowed the humiliation to occur. It would, however, be a visible moment, a hinge that others might use to open a door. Marcus rose, straightened the robe, and prepared to receive the first set of statements. Outside, phones kept the morning alive. Inside, the clerks prepared logs and sealed hard drives. The first required step had been taken. An injustice had been documented and placed before the people whose job it is to ensure the law answers when it is asked. The robe might be a symbol. The cameras might be a weapon. The people might be witnesses who would not let the moment dissolve into an ordinary day. The rest, investigations, possible charges, institutional reform, would be processes that required more than the morning's dramatic arc. They would require the slow, stubborn work of persistence. Still, in the instant Marcus stepped back into the courtroom and raised the gavel, the truth of the title settled into the memory of everyone present. They had mocked him during the arrest, and minutes later, the man they had mocked entered court in robes. The rest of the story, a story of evidence, inquiry, resistance, and possibly reform, was only beginning to unwind. The statements arrived like a steady rain, short, factual, human. People filed into a small hearing room where a clerk took down time, place, and words. Martha read names from her list and nodded as each witness signed the form that would anchor a later affidavit. Kenny gave a precise account of the sequence in the lot, noting the timestamps as if measuring something sacred. Jerome's mother described what her son had seen. Jerome, perched on a chair with knees too big for his age, described the sound of laughter and the dull metallic click that had started everything. Attorneys who had only minutes earlier mouthed incredulous vows to one another now sat still and spoke plainly into record. Officer Patterson came in last. He had spent the morning at the edge of the scene and the weeks that followed thinking about the shape of his choices. He sat in the folding chair, palms flat on his knees. He did not try to explain away his uniform. He did not apologize theatrically. He spoke in a voice that trembled once and then steadied. "I was there," he said. "I followed orders. But I saw it wrong at first. I watched them cuff him, and I did nothing to stop it. I can tell you what I saw. I can give you the times on my radio log. I can show you the messages I sent. It was the sort of testimony that prosecutors prize. Factual, corroborating, not a sweeping moralizing, but a list of acts and clock times that lined up with camera footage."
Patterson's admission made him an awkward hinge in the case, neither villain nor hero in the simplistic sense, but a person whose account reinforced the pattern the evidence suggested. Sarah Chen, who had watched the evidence spool the day Marcus had returned to the bench, now assembled a file with the efficiency of someone who had made a career of matching acts to law. Dashcam footage, security camera files, handheld videos uploaded with metadata intact, witness statements, the clerk's log with timestamps, Martha's filing cabinet with notes on prior complaints, a personnel file that, once she read it, made the pattern arrow-shaped, a string of civilian complaints about rough stops, excessive force, and curt reports. Some had been resolved quietly, some had been poorly investigated, some had been logged but never substantiated. "There's more than one incident here," Sarah said in a conference room where the mayor and the commissioner and their legal advisors sat, the city's institutional calm failing only in the set of their mouths. "If we proceed with a record that shows a consistent pattern. This is not a single lapse, it's a series of choices." Frank Morrison, the union president, held the posture of someone who believed the first duty of organization was defense. His opening remarks were crisp and predictable. Officers are trained, officers have rights, due process for members must be respected. The union's counsel requested access to the whole file and threatened to litigate any action taken without giving the accused the chance to respond. It was a play out of the well-worn scripts of institutional friction. Mayor Patricia Williams listened with the face of someone balancing ethics with municipal risk. She had arrived early in the scandal and stayed late in the politics of it. "We must show the public we take it seriously," she said. "We must also make sure we don't compromise the investigation."
Commissioner Hayes, initially defensive in the lobby, had absorbed a day's worth of pressure. He watched Sarah and Marcus in the files and felt the gears of his department grind under the weight of the evidence. He was not eager to be undone, but he was, in the quiet of the conference room, pragmatic. "If the evidence supports charges," he said, "we will follow the process. Administrative leave for the officers involved, full cooperation with the prosecutor's office." Administration dangled like a legal cudgel and a political necessity. Marcus asked for no special favors. He wanted chain of custody preserved and the appearance of impartiality. He insisted that the internal review be supplemented by an external investigator to avoid the perception, real enough, that a system investigating itself would be tempted to smooth edges. "Independent counsel," Marcus said. "We need someone who reports to civilian oversight and to no single agency in our chain." The word independent invited both relief and resistance.
It meant the city would have to allow outsiders to sift through personnel files and radio logs. It meant the union might tilt toward litigation to keep certain things private. It meant the police department's reputation would be at stake. The independent investigator arrived 2 days later, a retired judge with a reputation for meticulousness and a paper trail of high-profile impartiality. He reviewed footage, subpoenaed records, interviewed witnesses in rooms with neutral light and oak tables. He took nothing on faith and everything on record. His first public statement was brief. "There is sufficient evidence to pursue misconduct proceedings." That phrasing, careful, judicial, moved conversation into the realm of official action. The first administrative move was swift. Miller and Wilson placed on administrative duty, Miller's patrol car taken into custody, both officers' body camera footage preserved separately from the department's archives. The union's lawyers bristled, but could not halt the paperwork. Commissioner Hayes issued a terse directive that the department would cooperate with the independent investigator and the prosecutor. It was an attempt to be seen doing the expected thing. In the weeks that followed the initial shock, the story opened like a field of small legal operations. Merit-based hearings, internal affairs interviews, subpoenas, motions. Language that read like court did, but was more blunt with human consequence. Sarah Chen met with civil attorneys and community leaders and mapped the epidemiology of complaint patterns. Martha compiled a binder skein that read like the courthouse's memory: times, dates, names. She found, tucked between routine dispute notes, references to rough stops and unnecessary force. Some complaints had been dropped, some had been closed for lack of corroboration. The security footage that morning, in contrast, provided an object lesson in why corroboration matters. When multiple devices recorded the same sequence, it became increasingly costly to interpret the event in a way that protected the officer's version. Behind all the procedural moves ran a public argument about accountability. Coffee shops and barber shops, social media threads, op-eds and local news panels debated the larger themes: training versus culture, accountability versus solidarity, the role of an independent review. Marcus read some of the commentary, but did not live in it. He kept his attention on the concrete steps that might put the incident where it could meaningfully be adjudicated. As evidence mounted, the legal calculus shifted. Sarah convened a meeting with a senior deputy prosecutor. "We have more than a single complaint," she said. "We have corroboration. Patterson's statement supports the sequence. We have the dash cam that shows force applied while the man is compliant. There's blood on the knee. There's the badge. There are prior complaints that show a pattern."
"Then we proceed," the deputy said, the words carrying the heavy responsibility of turning fact into formal accusation. "We file charges." Charges were drafted. They included assault and false imprisonment. Civil rights violations were considered, and a decision was made to include them alongside the state charges where the elements could be met. The union filed a preliminary motion to contest the evidence chain and to protect its members' rights. Public hearings were scheduled as the department's discipline calendar moved in parallel with the criminal case. The courtroom that eventually took Miller's case was not the large bench where Marcus presided, but a municipal courtroom where the grind of local justice happens: preliminary hearings, arraignments, a roster of assigned counsel and courtroom deputies. Miller was arraigned and entered a denial. The appearance was formal, almost procedural, a nod to an adversarial system that insists on its rituals. Outside, the community organized peaceable vigils that read like municipal pressure: signs, speeches, petitions, and the steady presence of people who would not let the moment fade. The union's lawyers tried to complicate the prosecution's route by attacking chain of custody and the method of acquiring certain handheld videos. They moved to suppress some footage and subpoenaed personnel records. Sarah's team anticipated this and had taken pains early to safeguard digital files, to timestamp uploads, to secure the original dashcam footage, and to document every transfer. It was tedious work, but it was the kind of tedium that wins the day in courtrooms: meticulous documentation. Patterson's cooperation became central. He testified at a preliminary hearing, sitting under oath and placed before cross-examination. He described the scene with careful precision. When asked why he had not intervened, he replied, "I was following what I had been taught, and I didn't know how to stop my colleagues without getting into trouble. But when I saw the judge on his knees, something in me said this was wrong. I regret not acting sooner." The defense's cross-examination tried to portray him as opportunistic, but his answers were steady, and his radio logs and messages lined up with his testimony. The judge on the bench, neutral in demeanor and firm in rulings, denied motions to throw out the dashcam footage and allowed the prosecution to proceed with the central evidence. At a community forum, weeks into the process, Marcus spoke to a packed recreational center. He didn't come to grandstand. He came to explain what the community could do to ensure that moments of abuse did not become habits repeated in private. Record, he told the room plainly. Report. Support civilian oversight. Demand that public institutions have clear protocols that do not subordinate evidence to internal convenience. His speech was pastoral in tone, but practical in content.
He asked for patience and persistence, emphasizing that real changes are measured in policies and budgets and continuous training, not just in one officer's punishment. Mayor Williams pushed policy in parallel. She proposed a package that included mandatory body cameras for all patrol officers, strengthened chain of custody rules for footage, a civilian oversight board with subpoena power, mandatory bias and de-escalation training, and a pilot program for integrity testing. The proposal was politically risky. Equipment costs, training budgets, and the creation of an empowered civilian body would all require votes and allocations in a city council that had members skeptical of large police reforms. Frank Morrison and the union publicly opposed the package as rushed and adversarial to officers' privacy concerns. He called for invested input from the union. The debate moved to council chambers, where passionate testimony from residents, Jerome included, filled the gallery. Marcus did not lobby loudly from the bench. He offered testimony at a hearing as a citizen and a judge who had experienced the system's failure firsthand. His testimony was measured, not transactional. "We ask for structure that makes the right action easier to take," he said. "Body cameras are not a cure-all, but they make decisions visible. Civilian oversight is not anti-police, it is pro-accountability." The city council's hearings were long and sometimes petty, but the location of public opinion had shifted. Voters wanted a visible corrective to the humiliation staged in the parking lot. The mayor used the leverage of public sentiment and the risk of costly legal settlements to shepherd a modified reform package through. Some items were pared back, others were retained with compromises. The Civilian Oversight Board was established, albeit with phased-in powers. Mandatory body cameras were approved, though the timeline stretched longer than advocates wanted. De-escalation training was funded and rolled out with external consultants monitoring its efficacy. It was, in municipal policy terms, both progress and compromise. Meanwhile, the criminal case moved toward trial. The prosecution made the strategic decision to try the case locally rather than seek federal charges. Sarah argued that state charges for assault and false imprisonment were within the local court's purview and made the clearest connection to the acts recorded on camera. Pre-trial motions continued. The defense accused the prosecution of bias, called for certain witnesses to be excluded, and accused the independent investigator of having a prejudiced eye. When trial began, the courtroom felt like the center of a small nation's attention. Cameras were kept out of the room itself by order, but rows of observers and a press pool in the gallery created the same sense of scrutiny the parking lot had started. Marcus sat in the gallery as a witness to the system he had asked to respond.
He did not testify in Miller's criminal case. His role was that of the injured party who had insisted that the record be kept. He watched the trial with the careful detachment of someone who knew that truth unfolded step by step. The prosecution's opening was simple and spare. Show the scene as it happened, match image to witness statements, make the chain of events unavoidable. They called Martha and Kenny. They played the dashcam footage, the security camera angles, the handheld videos stitched together with timestamps. The effect in the courtroom was not cinematic in a crafted sense, it was juridical. people saw a sequence that matched what their phones had registered that morning. Patterson testified again at trial, this time under the weight of a prosecutor's direct examination and the defense's cross. He described the training he had received, the hierarchy he had internalized, and the moment when the cognitive dissonance in his chest became a moral imperative. His testimony was not a dramatic turning point created for effect. It was a sequence of small truths that, when assembled, made the defense's narrative fragile. The defense tried to argue that Miller had reasonable suspicion and had acted within the bounds of training, that the push to the knee was a standard control move, and that the minor injury to Marcus's knee was accidental, the byproduct of necessary force. The prosecution answered with the harsh clarity of juxtaposed images: a man compliant, a badge visible, an officer who did not ask a house of questions before applying force. When photographs of the bloodstain on Marcus's trouser knee were shown, no theatrics followed. The image simply existed as factual accompaniment to testimony. The jury deliberated. The waiting stretched like a taut wire through the courthouse. Outside, supporters of both sides gathered, their faces smudged by worry and conviction. Jerome came back to sit with his mother in the gallery, a place he had never sat before. He looked small in the folding chair, but enormous in the way someone new to public life can be when they show up. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on the assault charge and on false imprisonment. There was no shouting in the courtroom. The judge read the verdict with that mechanical sadness that belongs to institutional voice. In the lobby, the room outside the court erupted in a low, heartfelt sound, people crying, hugging, holding phones to capture the moment. Marcus stood in the doorway, the robe folded across his arm, the gavel distant and unused. He did not feel vindictive satisfaction. He felt the practical relief of a system having followed its course, and more quietly, the sorrow of a community that had needed to fight to get a basic recognition of harm.
Miller's conviction did not erase the fact that once he had the protection of a union and a culture that had let certain behaviors pass, it did not restore the small hours when an ordinary man had bled on a public pavement. Justice, in this narrow sense, had been rendered. The sentencing hearing that followed imposed a penalty aligned with local statutes, neither exaggerated nor symbolic beyond legal measure. The record would include the conviction, appeals would follow, the civil suits would be filed in due course. The city council negotiated settlements and policy changes, a quiet bureaucracy of restitution and re-regulation. The union's resistance did not evaporate when the verdict came down. Frank Morrison's public posture softened into a call for lessons learned and new training that did not erode officers' protections. Internally, however, the relationship between the union and the department shifted. Some officers who had once defended the rougher patterns began privately to question their practices. Others doubled down, blaming cameras and social media for the occasion of accountability. The culture, as cultures do, adjusted incrementally. Commissioner Hayes, who had been defensive at first, emerged from the sequence with a different tone. In a public hearing months later, he testified about the adopted reforms and the ways the department would change implementation. He spoke carefully about the need to rebuild trust and to ensure officers felt supported in doing the right thing. Whether his words would be matched by sustained action was a question left to time and to budgeting battles in city offices. Patterson's path diverged from the thin line of service that had nearly swallowed him. He volunteered in community outreach programs, went back to school on nights, and enrolled in a pre-law curriculum at the local community college. It was not a dramatic conversion, but a series of small choices: mentoring teenagers, speaking at police academy classes, pushing for curriculum that included scenarios that emphasized de-escalation over dominance. He came to a plaque dedication months later, wearing casual clothes, not uniform, holding a child's hand and smiling in a way that suggested both relief and a new steadiness. The city created a plaque to designate the exact spot on the courthouse lot where the morning had become a public turning point. The dedication ceremony was modest: a small stage, a ribbon, the plaque's bronze face catching the sun. Mayor Williams spoke about civic duty. Commissioner Hayes read a prepared statement about commitments to reform and to partnership with the Civilian Review Board. Frank Morrison sent a representative and issued remarks about the complexities of reform. Jerome was invited to cut the ribbon. He stood stiff and proud, notebook under his arm like a talisman. "Let this be a reminder," Marcus said at the dedication.
Not of a single failure, but of the moment when we chose to record, to witness, and to press our institutions to account. People left with plates from a community barbecue. Chalk art lay on the steps. Children had written words on the ground: witness, dignity, record, and small handprints dotted the margins. The plaque read simply, "Here, a citizen's dignity was defended by witnesses and law." It was not a heroic epitaph. It was a bureaucratic acknowledgement with civic weight. The reforms were not panaceas. Budget cycles thinned programs sometimes, political attention drifted, training sessions proved necessary but insufficient to change deep-seated cultures. Yet the Civilian Oversight Board, even in its limited first phase, forced transparency in ways that had been previously avoided. Body cameras, once fully rolled out, produced a new normal, more recorded interactions, more material for review, more reasons to think twice before escalating. Months later, in a quieter scene, Marcus met with a group of young people in a courthouse classroom. Jerome sat in the front row, scribbling notes, eyes bright. Marcus spoke about the law not in lectures, but in human terms. Law is a tool, he said. It can build or it can be used to hide harm. Your job, when you enter whatever field you choose, is to make sure it builds. He told them a story, brief, factual, about the morning and about what came after. He emphasized the ordinary civic acts that had mattered: someone recording, someone insisting on chain of custody, an independent investigator saying the evidence was sufficient, a prosecutor willing to pursue charges. None of those were spectacular in themselves, he said. They were steps. They were ordinary acts of responsibility. Jerome, who had once watched from the steps, had begun volunteering at the courthouse that summer. He shadowed clerks, helped file small papers, and listened to old cases with the hunger of someone starting to imagine their own place in public life. He had written in his notebook that morning, "See you in court someday." He now had a folder of volunteer forms, and occasionally a look of adult curiosity around his eyes. The community's healing did not happen in a single photograph. It came in a series of meals shared in the courtyard after hearings, in public forums that put institutional people in rooms with residents they served, in a youth program that offered mentoring at the courthouse, and in a modest scholarship fund started by citizens who wanted to encourage Patterson and other recruits to pursue training that emphasized ethics and de-escalation. Marcus watched these patterns from a distance and with participation. He returned to his work, dockets, opinions, sentencing, tempered now by the knowledge that authority's symbols can be stripped from a person, and dignity must be guarded not by robes alone, but by the steady presence of law working to do what it promises.
Sometimes he received letters. One came from a young law student who said the morning on the lot had convinced her to study criminal defense and to think about how the justice system treats those who hold no public office. Another, from a mother who had seen the plaque on a rainy day, thanked him for pushing the process forward. When the appeals came in Miller's case, they followed the procedural rhythm of the system: motions, briefs, oral arguments. Some argued that certain evidentiary rulings had been erroneous, others sought reduced sentences. The appellate process stretched over time. It was a reminder that even after a conviction, the wheels of law grind slowly and ensure review, a frustrating but essential feature of a system that resists both summary triumph and summary condemnation. Marcus's private reflections were quiet and persistent. He thought often of the moment the cuffs had clicked. He thought of the smallness of the sound and the enormity of the moral decision to preserve rather than to smooth. He believed then, and continued to insist, that the power of one person telling the truth in an ordinary register could alter the arc of many people's lives. At night, after work, he sometimes took the long route home past the courthouse lot. He would look at the spot where the plaque was set into the stone and remember the way phones had raised like a small flock of witnesses. That image, upright phones, little screens catching light, had stayed with him as a metaphor. Witnesses made lawful acts visible. Witnessing, he had learned over a lifetime in public service, required courage and an infrastructure that honored those who did it. The young officer who had once been prone to following orders without judgment had gone on to law school. Patterson's trajectory was not a tidy arc of redemption, but rather a path marked by steady choices: courses, internships, community work. He told Marcus in a quiet hallway, "I realized I wanted to be part of a system that I could trust. I want to build that trust, not be the kind of person who scares people." Jerome, now a teenager, visited the courthouse with a different posture. He walked the steps as if they were part of his future, not as a place where he had once seen humiliation, but as a place where he had seen the law respond. He still carried the notebook, though it had frayed at the edges. The phrase he had written months ago, "See you in court someday," had become both a promise and a practical plan. He had, in quiet corners, asked clerks about internships. He had watched proceedings and asked questions with a steady curiosity. On the courthouse lot where the plaque shone, people had painted chalk messages that endured until rain wiped them away.
The mural had been replaced by a more permanent sign showing hotline numbers for reporting police misconduct,
instructions on how to submit digital files to the Civilian Oversight Board, and a small panel explaining the city's commitment to accountability measures. The sign was modest and bureaucratic, but it carried the capability to turn witnesses into formal reports. Months after the verdict, Marcus sat in his chambers and considered how fragile progress could be. He wrote a short op-ed for the local paper that argued for sustained funding of the Oversight Board and for embedding de-escalation practices in continuing education for officers. He did not seek to indict an entire profession, nor to absolve its members. He wanted to stabilize the ladders that led from complaint to consequence, to make sure the path he had taken that morning, the one of preserving records and insisting on process, was not an anomaly for someone else who might lack the robe's access. There were small human moments that testified to the story's unexpected grace. At a community dinner, Patterson sat next to Marcus and, in a soft voice, thanked him for the mercy he had shown when he spoke to him that morning. "You didn't shame me publicly," Patterson said. "You asked me to tell the truth. That mattered." Marcus accepted the thanks with his characteristic modesty. "We all have to be able to change," he said. "The system has to allow it." The plaque remained, the reforms remained, and the work continued. For some, it was an agenda item. For others, it was a life changed by the visibility of evidence and the responsibility of witnesses. The union retooled some of its internal training modules to emphasize community relations, not as a concession, but as self-preservation. The department invested in more robust body camera storage and protocols for transfer. The Civilian Oversight Board, though not yet fully empowered, began to issue reports that urged more transparency and a sustained public conversation. In the end, the case's most endearing legacy was less about a single conviction and more about a civic lesson, that institutions require witnesses to become accountable, that evidence must be preserved, that ordinary people holding phones and demanding signatures and conserving tapes can create the scaffold upon which law might do its work. The robe, the badge, the plaque, all were symbols. The real substance came from the work that followed: filings, meetings, hearings, trainings, mentoring, and the slow, stubborn reweaving of trust. One evening, after a long day of hearings and community sessions, Marcus received a short message on his phone. It was Jerome. The text read simply, "See you in court someday. I'll be ready." Marcus typed a quick reply, "I'll hold a seat." He put his phone down and looked at the robe hanging on the back of his chair, like a quiet witness, as if it had absorbed some small share of the morning's pain and kept it in order.
He thought of the young officer who had changed course, of the mayor who had made difficult political choices, of the prosecutor who had matched evidence to law, and of the gardener of the courthouse who had scrubbed at the pavement stain until his hands were raw. He thought of the plaque's bronze face and the kids who had scrawled chalk messages that rain could not fully wash away. There was no triumphalism in his thought, only a responsibility renewed, to keep insisting that dignity be preserved by institutions that can be persuaded to act when enough citizens demand it. He believed that witnessing was not a passive act, but a civic labor. He believed that recording an injustice was the first step toward changing the structures that allowed it. If you were to stand now where the plaque marks the place, you would see the courthouse facade, the carved phrase, and people moving through their ordinary lives. You would remember that the image of a man cuffed on the pavement and then walking back into the court in robes is not merely a photograph. It is a hinge that opens a question. What will we do when we witness wrong? Will we be a passing audience, or will we be custodians of evidence and stewards of change? If this story has moved you, share it, not for applause, but so someone else knows the importance of watching, recording, and speaking up. When an ordinary day transforms into an extraordinary test of our institutions, the small acts of ordinary people, holding up a phone, signing a statement, insisting on a chain of custody, become the mechanisms of accountability. They had mocked him during the arrest. Minutes later, the black man entered court in robes. The rest of the work, investigations, reforms, trials, community healing, required persistence long after the camera stopped rolling. It required courage in the small, boring places of municipal governance and sustained civic engagement. It required that witnesses do one more thing: make what they saw part of the public record. So record when you must, speak when you can,
Support oversight where it forms. Vote for processes that elevate evidence over convenience. Keep asking that our institutions answer when asked. Jerome's last text to Marcus, months after the plaque was set, read, "See you in court someday. I'm studying." Marcus smiled and answered, "We'll make room." And in that small exchange lived a hopeful, tiring, necessary work of a city trying, imperfectly, to live up to its own carved creed.